I'm not going to tell you why to trust maps. I would say this talk is more on the other end of the spectrum and why we should maybe not trust maps. And I know this is a session on theory. There is going to be a little bit of theory here, actually borrowing from communication science and communication studies, but for the most part, this is covering a research study that I did as a PhD student at Penn State. And yeah, let's get into it. So talk is visualize how maps and images impact misinformation perception. So this research is really motivated by the massive advances in generative AI, as well as the increasing abundance of satellite maps or satellite images, I'll use those terms interchangeably, in this presentation in modern media. And so many of you in this room are probably familiar with Mark Mamonier's seminal piece, How to Lie with Maps. And so maps have this intrinsic capacity to mislead people, yet a lot of people in our field also argue that people trust maps blindly a lot of the times. And this is problematic because the highly processed nature of satellite images and the advances in generative AI make it easier than ever to mislead people with maps. Here we see two popular press articles. The first one on the left is showcasing a set of airstrips in Russia, and upon a cursory glance, it looks pretty okay, but in reality, if you look at the images really carefully, you can tell that these images, my clickers, there we go. The jets are actually painted onto the airways, and so there's actually not any aircraft here, and so Russia was misleading Western powers as to where their aircraft were built up, and only when a specific geospatial intelligence analysis was done that they could actually tell this. The second popular press article on the right highlights that in this recent conflict with India and Pakistan, that there was a lot of AI-generated media that were flooding social media, and this media was trying to attempt to incite further violence, further contempt against these adversaries. And so there were different images that were being circulated of destroyed buildings, and the different sides were blaming each other for this destruction. When you couple this with the ease of disseminating these maps, as shown with these two BBC articles that are highlighting how these maps that were misleading went viral, we really have what I would call a Cardo conundrum on our hands. And so to deal with this Cardo conundrum, this study is exploring why and if people have a general tendency to trust satellite maps, and if people trust satellite maps when they're included in misinformation compared to text as well as just regular images. And so the theoretical basis of this study is the main model, and this is a model that's developed in communication psychology literature. The main model suggests that different communication devices have these affordances, they have these different features, and that these different affordances cue or trigger these heuristics. And heuristics, you can think of heuristics as these quick decision tools, and we use these all the time. Has anyone ever bought something on Amazon because it has 5-star reviews? Okay, I'm seeing some nods, seeing some hands. So that's a quick heuristic that our brains use to sift through all the information and make a quick decision so we don't have to deal with all this cognitive bandwidth. And so these heuristics allow us to make quick decisions, and therefore they also influence how we evaluate the quality of information, and therefore how we potentially evaluate the trustworthiness or the credibility of misinformation and regular information. The main model has its name because it has 4 different classes of affordances, and so we have modality, which is how information is presented to us, whether it be text, image, video, etc. Agency, which is where's the information coming from. Interactivity, how engaging is the information, how interactive is it, is there an interaction loop between the human as well as the technology, and then navigability, how easy is the information to access. In this presentation, we're mainly going to focus on modality and agency effects. Specifically, there's 2 relevant heuristics that I was interested in looking at with people, if these heuristics are cued by maps, and if in turn these influence people's credibility assessments of misinformation. So the first one is the realism heuristic, and this you can think of as seeing is believing. And so more realistic information is perceived as more believable because it looks real, it looks tangible. And so when people see these really vivid satellite imagery, satellite maps, they might believe it more because it looks realistic. The second one is the authority heuristic. So historically, map making has been a somewhat gate-kept profession where a lot of the times people, only a select group had access to the data, had the technology. Obviously that's changed quite a bit. I would say not as much so in the satellite imagery realm of things where remote sensing data is still extremely very expensive. It's harder to process. And so people might trust maps because it comes from an authoritative source. It comes from an authoritative figure. So, onto the study design. In this study, we used this news article that's showing a fire that happened in Central Park. You can see here that it just has this this fake news outlet, and then there's a text-based condition, there's a ground image, so there's an article that just has the text, one that has a ground image corroborating what's seen in the text. This is generated by AI, and then the map is a map that's photoshopped satellite map. And so we tested these 3 different conditions to see if one is more trustworthy, more credible than the other. And so our research questions, we had 2 research questions. One is, do maps bolster the perceived credibility, that is, the perceived trustworthiness of misinformation news articles? And because we had ample theoretical basis, because of the main model as well as prior empirical evidence, we were able to translate this broad research question into 2 hypotheses. And so the first hypothesis was that the ground images as well as the satellite images would cue the realism heuristic compared to the text, and so people would see both of the images as real and then therefore more trustworthy. And then the second one would be that the satellite maps, the satellite images would cue the authority heuristic compared to the text or the ground image, and therefore bolstering the perceived credibility, the perceived trustworthiness of the information. The second research question was, do maps improve the recall of misinformation? And so Aileen Buckley talked about debunking, pre-bunking yesterday, and a lot of times an issue with misinformation is that we can correct it, but sometimes people will remember the information, still remember the incorrect information even after it was debunked. Here we didn't translate this into specific hypotheses because we didn't have ample theoretical backing to operationalize this, as well as there wasn't enough empirical evidence to translate this into specific hypotheses. Here you can see a rough outline of the procedure. And so participants, we first had them do some screening questions to make sure that they're eligible. We recruited 250 participants through this platform called Cloud Research. It's this platform that people can sign up to do different research. I argue that it's better than the traditional university sample that is often done in a lot of cartographic research, where we sample just like 20-year-olds who are in large undergraduate classes. And so here, at least, you can provide different filters, different quotas, so that your target demographic is meeting your sample a little bit better than the university sample. It still has its drawbacks because it's just people who are online and tech savvy enough to sign up for this, but there's always going to be pros and cons with different sampling. Participants saw the misinformation article, and then they answered some questions related to trustworthiness as well as the heuristics. Okay, doing good on time. So now on to the results. We found that there were no significant effects on message credibility or perceived trustworthiness of the misinformation. And so there was no difference between perceived trustworthiness compared to the text versus the ground image versus the satellite maps. And so we didn't have any support for hypothesis 1 broadly. We also found that there were no significant mediation effects, and so we didn't find that those 2 heuristics actually were causing changes in the credibility. And mediation refers to looking a little bit closer and looking at what is the mechanism that's driving the causal relationship. And so if we have an independent variable, in this case the modality, so whether it's text, image, or map, and the dependent variable of trust, we can find that maybe satellite maps lead to greater trust, but then mediation analysis actually looks at what is the underlying variable causing the change. And here we were thinking, we predicted that realism would cause this, which we found no significant support for this, and then also authority, we didn't find any significant support for it. And then finally, we found that there were no significant effects on recall, and so there was no better recall of the misinformation, whether it was text versus image or whether it was map versus text. And so I know there's been a lot of baseball going on with the playoffs, and so I'm going to use this analogy. You might think, like, 3 strikes, you're out. This is, what's going on here? We didn't find any significant results. But this is good. This is good science, and I argue that we need more studies that are finding no significant changes, and this is still important research. And it's also always important to contextualize your research. There's always going to be limitations. There's always pros and cons for different research methods. And so one of the reasons why we might have seen no change in effects is that the stimuli were very sensationalist, right? So it was an article showing a fire in Central Park. So people might have seen this and thought, why didn't I see that on CNN, Fox News, InfoWars, whatever, however you're consuming information? Why didn't I see that somewhere else? So maybe choosing a more realistic, a little less popular story might have changed the results. It was also arguably an unrealistic setting in terms of how people consume information, right? Most of the time, all of us are consuming information on our phones, we're scrolling, and we're not critically analyzing the information, and so it's hard to replicate that similar thing when people are conducting a study on their own. They might trying to be extra cautious because they want to make the researcher happy, essentially. And so trying to recreate some sort of setting where you're recreating like Twitter or Blue Sky, where people are scrolling and trying to emulate this more heuristic, this less critical processing would be important. And the other thing that's I think is really important is that this is a single study, and that a lot of cartographic research will do a single study on a particular topic and then we'll move on, which is not how science is actually supposed to operate. We need replication studies, we need reproducible studies, and so I really hope that more research in cartography validates existing research. It's not sexy, it's, your editor might not love it, but we need more of that in order to grow as a scientific discipline. With that, I think I have some time for questions. I thank you for your time and being here after NACIS Night Out.
Can anybody hear me? Okay. Questions? We'll take about 5 minutes for questions.
Carolyn.
So I know that you were on the board of CAGIS, the CAGIS journal, is that correct? Mm-hmm. And you kind of mentioned that we really need to be doing kind of things that aren't so sexy. Do you think that this or replication studies of this could be published and would be published in, say, kind of are more quantitative, highly regarded cartography journals?
Sure. Great question. So summarize the question if people didn't hear it. The question was, is it actually possible to publish these kinds of replication studies? Would journals actually and editors be supportive of this? I would hope so. I haven't actually been to I won't be at AAG, so I won't be at the CAGIS meeting with the different editors. I know it's common in a lot of other fields and a lot of really important journals. So I think that it's imperative that folks who are on editorial boards, so like yourself, like myself, we have our voice heard and we try to pave the way for that, because I think it is really important. I think that it's a huge glaring shortcoming of cartographic science, to be honest with you. So I'd say I'm optimistic. And so, maybe this is where we think about like the ICA, right? We have we want a lot of change there. We also want a lot of change with the cartographic journals. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions?
Any other questions? All righty. Thank you, Dr. Prestby.
Okay. Thank you for your time.